All right. Welcome everyone to our second session of the day for the Middle East Dialogue Conference. I'm glad you're all able to join us. I think the bulk of our audience is online and our participants are also online. This is the panel for discussion of current issues in Iran. And we are very glad to have with us today three participants whom I will introduce very briefly, and they can introduce themselves at more length in a moment. We have Dr. Mehrzad Bourejerdi from Missouri S&T, a longtime notable scholar of Iranian politics. We have also Dr. Ladan Rahbari, an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam, and not with us yet, but I think joining us in a moment or two should be Dr. Saeed Golkar, a professor at the University of Tennessee. And they're all going to speak on various aspects of recent Iranian politics. So what I'm going to do is turn the session over to them. We will start with Dr. Bourejerdi, and then we'll have some Q&A after all three have spoken initially. So does that sound good to the participants? Everyone set? All right, then Dr. Bourejerdi, I will turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Warwick, and the organizers of this conference. Delighted to be with you here. I am a professor of political science and the Dean of the College of Arts, Sciences, and Education at Missouri University of Science and Technology. And today I will be talking about how Iran is a theocratic electoral authoritarian regime. And to make that argument, I will be discussing the elections for parliament and the assembly of experts that took place just last month in Iran, to give you a sense of why I think this type of designation is proper for the Iranian state. As you know, there is an argument that no ruling class, considers themselves to be undemocratic. They all claim that they, utilize elections, and therefore they should be viewed in a democratic manner. Indeed, when we look at the track record of the Islamic Republic of Iran, we come across a fascinating fact. The fact is that over the last 45 years, since 1979 revolution, Iran has held a record number 39 elections. So in short, they have had 0.9 elections every year since 79. To them, this of course symbolizes and represents the fact that they view themselves as being a democracy, albeit a religious one, with the extensive support of the population. And yet, as we all know, there are a lot of problems with that type of argument, in the sense that elections are not necessarily free. There is a major filtering of candidates taking place. There are appointed bodies that can disqualify candidates without really the need to even provide an explanation as to what's going on. And I will demonstrate this claim by sharing with you some data that I have gathered regarding the last election from last month. Now, let me say the following. The Iranian state, because it was born through a revolution, considers substantial voter turnout as a validation of its revolutionary principles, right? Even though it might be a tired revolution after 45 years, because as we all know, revolutions run out of steam after a while. But for them, they want to keep this sort of fire of revolutionary zeal going, and they refer to substantial voter turnout as an indication of this revolutionary passion in the country. Now, the problem is the following. Since 79, the number of eligible voters in Iran has gone up from 20 million to 60 million people, thanks to the demographic explosion that the country has experienced, right? Iran in 1979 had a population of 36 million. Today, it has over 80 million. So the question for the government always is, how do you engage these eligible voters and bring them to the polls? Now, the argument I'm going to make is that what we have been seeing recently, and by recently I mean over the course of the last 10 years in particular, has been a sharp decline in the percentage of people taking part in elections, no matter of what sort, whether they are parliamentary elections, presidential elections, or elections for municipal bodies, or this other clerical assembly called the Assembly of Experts. In all cases, we see a decline in participation rates since 2012. It has been really on a downward spiral since 2012. In regard to the election last month, they were simultaneous elections held both for parliament and for this clerical body that I mentioned is called the Assembly of Experts. For those not familiar with Iranian politics, the major function of this Assembly of Experts is really to supervise the job performance of the supreme leader, and when the time comes, to select the next supreme leader. Considering that the current supreme leader is in his 80s, and this assembly is chosen for an 8-year term, it is quite probable that the recently elected assembly will be the one that has to choose the next supreme leader in this regard. So election, therefore, became important for the government that is concerned about sustaining itself, longevity and the like, in this light. The problem was that, of course, 2 years ago, in 2022, we had a massive oppositional movement in the country that I'm sure everyone is aware of, called the Women Life Freedom Movement. This was a movement that really contested the authority of the state in more than one ways. It was, in many ways, a political heart attack for the government, although not, fatal. Nonetheless, a heart attack for the government in terms of what was it that the population was asking for. Now, as a lingering legacy of that 2022 Women Life Freedom movement, there were serious calls for electoral boycotts, right? And urging people not to participate because they think they're, of course, upset with the repression that the state used to put down the movement, and they feel that therefore elections are useless in that regard. Okay, the government told us that despite these calls for electoral boycott, that 25 million people casted their votes. In other words, a participation rate of 41%. Now, there are two problems with this type of statistics. One is that there is no way to independently verify the authenticity of these statistics. The Iranian Ministry of Interior does not allow anyone access, to these things. There were no international observers to be able to vouch for the validity of the elections. Furthermore, the elections, the participation rate also includes a spoiled ballots. In other words, if I go to the polls and turn in a blank ballot or write, the name of somebody who is not even on the ballot, or my handwriting is not eligible and things of that sort, then that is still counted as participation rate. So you can see how that even the 41% participation rate can be rather inflated in this regard. Okay. On the other hand, in terms of number of candidates, we saw something quite interesting happening. There are 290 seats available in the Iranian parliament, and we had 24,829 individuals registering for these 290 seats. Among them, there were 3,000 female candidates, which was a record for Iran, over the last 40 years. Interestingly enough, the vetting bodies decided that they were going to approve the credentials of 61% or something like 15,200 of these 24,000 candidates, but with an important caveat. The caveat being that since they had to be investigated in terms of their backgrounds to see whether they are, politically legitimate, the individuals that were approved were by and large belonging to the conservative persuasion. They were from the conservative wing. Indeed, a slate of candidates that the reformist camp put up could not list more than 160 candidates throughout the entire country as being, sort of moderate or reformist out of these 15,000 individuals. So in short, what I mean is that, yes, the approval rate was high, but because of this filtering, they were of a particular persuasion here. Now, looking at Tehran, the capital, which is not only the geographical capital of the country, but also its political nerve center, I think gives us some insights into what might have happened here. Tehran has some 10 million eligible voters, and the voter turnout rate was only 34%, the lowest of all provinces in Iran. Indeed, the gentleman who was mentioned as the front runner, the one who got the most votes in a city of 10 million, his votes were only 600,000, meaning he got 8% of eligible voters to vote for him, and that was it. Out of those 290 candidates, a record number 45 candidates did not manage to get the required minimum of 20% of the votes cast that are needed according to Iranian constitution to be elected. Therefore, next month, we are going to have runoff elections to fill the remaining seats in the Iranian parliament, which is called the Majlis here. So in short, I think what we are seeing is some emerging cleavage between the state and the citizenry, right? In terms of the trust, believing in the system, etc. I will come to a conclusion about what this all means in a minute. But let me also say a couple of words about the other election that was happening simultaneously for that assembly of experts, the clerical body. Here again, imagine this is an assembly that is supposed to have 88 clerics sitting there because they are supposed to be the individuals qualified to choose the next supreme leader. And in this round, 510 individuals put themselves forward as candidates. Only 28% of them were deemed qualified. So imagine, even if you are an established cleric, that is no guarantee that the regime considers you qualified for this particular body, right? So even clerics get disqualified. So what happens in a case of really electoral engineering, the ratio of candidates to seats available was 1.6 to 1. So not even 2 to 1, right? In other words, you had a very good chance once you had passed the filtering process for you to be elected into this body, as most of them were. Another fascinating feature about elite alienation in the state is the following. Among those clerics who were disqualified, believe it or not, was the former president, Hassan Rouhani. So he was president of the country for 8 years, but he was disqualified, deemed not qualified to stand for this body. In addition, 2 former intelligence ministers were also disqualified, right? Again, these are, as you know, intelligence ministers in Iran are appointed by the supreme leader himself. But even these figures were deemed unqualified now to stand for election because, again, they had run afoul of the prevalent political system and political persuasion at the moment. So, as I mentioned before, when we look at the last 10 years of electoral data, we see that participation rates now fluctuates between 41 to 49%, right? That deprives the state of the claim that, the majority of the population is taking part in the election. So you might say that this is something in the negative column in terms of claim to popularity, for sure. But look at the positive side from the perspective of the conservatives running Iran right now. Thanks to these low participation rates, the conservative wing now dominates not only the two elected assemblies, the parliament and the assembly of religious experts, but they also control the executive branch. Okay, so we know that the conservatives are estimated to have a solid electoral base of maybe around 25% of the population. Okay, but thanks to these 25% who are mobilized, who are motivated to participate in election, they are managed to become the majority in terms of electoral outcomes. So, in my view, what is happening right now is that the Iranian regime has decided that consolidation of power by conservative forces is more important than popular legitimacy. And that elections that we in the West take to be a major yardstick for a democracy has really been emptied of its meaning. Therefore, I think it will be foolish on our part to take things at face value and argue that merely on account of the fact that a government, holds election, albeit, one election a year, that it symbolizes a democratic system. Now, I will end with this note. Why is it important that the conservatives are really in control of every branch of power in Iran, and of course, the supreme leader himself being of this political persuasion? As we all know, and perhaps my colleagues will be speaking to these after me, we are seeing an escalating tension in Iran's international relations, be it with Israel, having to do with the Gaza war, be it in terms of its outreach to its proxy forces in the Middle East, etc. And it serves us well to remember that the folks sitting in Tehran making the decisions are now uniformly of this conservative persuasion, and therefore we should not be surprised, right, if in the coming weeks or months we see a course of action that might raise the level of tension that we have already seen. I'm over my 15 minutes, so let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bourgerdi. I want to say that that was a really, really interesting talk. I learned a great deal from it. Also, while you were speaking, those of us here at Villanova experienced a small earthquake, which is very unusual for us. So there was a bit of distraction here at our end. But thank you very much for that. We will move now to our next speaker, Dr. Ladan Rahbari. Would you like to take it up from here, please?
Yes, thank you so much for this interesting talk, Dr. Bourgerdi. And thank you for the invitation and for having me here today. Good time of the day to you. I'm joining you from Amsterdam, and it is late afternoon here. I am Ladan Rahbari. I'm a political sociologist, assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam, and a senior researcher at the International Migration Institute, also located in Amsterdam. I do have a PowerPoint. It's very minimal, but it may help you follow my arguments here. Is it okay if I share this, Dr. Warwick?
Let me see if I can allow you to screen share. It might take us a minute to.
I think I'm allowed. I already did it.
Oh, there we go. Perfect. Wonderful.
There it is. Okay, so the paper that I present today is actually under the second round of review by the Journal of Digest of Middle East Studies, and is called Our Enemy is Right Here, The Woman, Life, Freedom Uprising and the Fissure in the Anti-Colonial Mythos of the Iranian Regime. This is a rather long analytical paper with a lot of historical backgrounds and many quotes, so I'm afraid I will be only touching upon the main idea here. So for the full view, you will have to wait for the paper to get published, hopefully soon. The paper examines the roots of anti-colonial sentiments in Iran during the 20th century and explores how, after its establishment in 1979, the current regime appropriates post-colonial and decolonial frameworks to meticulously construct its anti-imperialist image and identity. It also assesses how this self-proclamation has been received regionally and globally, contributing to the state's popularity among other regional groups and countries in the Middle East who also identify as anti-West. At the end of the article, I turn to the Woman, Life, Freedom Uprising and discuss how it has helped break down this identity and how the constructed kind of decolonial, anti-imperialist narrative has become a point of fracture in Iran. My intention is not to make a generalized claim about the Iranian population. That is simply impossible, but rather to perhaps demonstrate how a narrative that counters the state's anti-imperialist discourse has recently gained momentum, at least among those who oppose the state. And the paper basically argues that this facade of anti-imperial, kind of anti-imperialist image or identity of the state is crumbling, and this could be considered a historic moment in Iran, although the transnational effects of this, I think, remain to be seen or studied. In the paper, I engage with post-colonial and anti-colonial nationalism as a concept, and this is a concept that is typically defined as the creation, dissemination, and mobilization of national identity narratives. And these narratives are often around the notion of victimhood and subalternity in relation to some hegemonic entities. And these hegemonic entities are often identified as, international powers, the West, the Europe, and are viewed through various perspectives, including material, normative, and epistemological dimensions. Now, of course, Iranians' engagement with this discourse has been shaped and deeply impacted by the country's history, marked by many foreign interventions. I think no respectable scholar can deny the existence of such historical, inclusive and deeply colonial interventions, not in the sense of administrative control in the country's affairs, but in the form of manipulating decisions, control over the ruling powers, institutions, and resources. I don't intend to get into these details, so I don't talk about the interventions a lot, but I discuss the consequences of them, including the fact that from 1953 to 1979, sovereignty and legitimacy of the ruling power at the time, the Pahlavis, becomes a major point of contention. And basically this provides fertile grounds for different kinds of revolutionary thoughts to emerge, including Islamic revolutionary thoughts, not only, of course, but also. Now, despite his publicly displayed and declared conservative views on women's rights, including a strong opposition to women's suffrage, Khomeini became the face of the revolution against imperialist Western powers. And in his own words, they're puppets in Iran. And I think this says a lot about the limits of non-intersectional post-colonial thinking. And this is something that already has been discussed, and critiques of post-colonial theory. I'm thinking immediately of scholars such as Fanon have already been argued, and that post-colonial and decolonial theory have not always engaged with gender as a concept, for instance. And this also says something about the Iranian society and revolutionary thought at the time, that, of course, with an exception of this, smaller fractions, women's activists and women's movements. Even at its best and most progressive, the revolutionary thought did not regard gender equality very high on its agenda. Women's issues were postponed or sacrificed for the greater good, which was defined as the anti-imperialist goal. So it is not surprising that and the anti-imperialist uprising in Iran did not bring about a democratic people's state and instead led to an autocratic and theocratic regime, because these internal tensions and paradoxes were not addressed adequately. Now, in the paper, I provide multiple quotes from the country's two consecutive supreme leaders, Khomeini and Khamenei, who employ normative notions of gender, sex, and sexuality in their expressions of antagonism to the West. Here you see one example, for instance. I'm not going to read through it, but basically Khomeini says in his plain-spoken, direct, and I would say accessible way that Western civilization is about nudity, openness of sexuality, is about undressing. And we see this line of thinking and this connection between gender and anti-imperialism continuing in Khamenei's discourse, as well as you see here from the example, Westerners take pride in immorality and nudity and so on. So you see there is this tension between gender equality and anti-Western and anti-imperialist discourse in a way that the anti-imperialist discourse in Iran simply does not want to co-live with gender equality and does not have respect for questions of, for instance, bodily integrity. So, of course, it's not a surprise that the regime's response to women's resistance against compulsory hijab, including the most recent uprising, the Women Life Freedom Movement, and the international support for Iranian women has also taken the form of a scapegoating, where the regime blames the West for coordinating the uprising, as it was very directly said by the Supreme Leader, and misleading Iranians into joining basically these protests. So again, the anti-imperialist narrative carries on. And I would say this scapegoating strategy is used in relation to internal matters, but also in relation to international matters. And one thing that helps perhaps this misinformation become credible for certain populations in the region, but also inside the country, is the strategy of mixing justified critiques of the West with misinformation and lies. So basically confusing the audience with lies, truths, and half-truths. And two very recent examples are in relation to, indeed, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the Israeli siege of Gaza in 2023, where the West is accused by the Islamic Republic of holding double standards, which is an idea that is held by many other countries across the globe, and also for practicing exceptionalism. So this strategy of mixing truths and lies does have an impact on some populations, and these messages do find resonance inside the country, but also specifically in the region. So basically, the anti-imperialist discourse presents itself as the contender to the West, and the suppression of women's dissent is justified as necessary for safeguarding the nation against imperialist threats. Now, while there has always been a critique to the Islamic regime's presentation of itself as the anti-colonial hero, in the paper I argue that the counter-narrative has become stronger thanks to the Women Life Freedom Movement's achievements. And I make this argument by presenting the manifestations of this shift in three different ways in the uprising. The first one is the uprising's direct messages in the form of slogans chanted by people on the streets when the street protests were happening. A transnational call for support and solidarity is specifically directed towards the West. And the third one is exposing the hypocrisy of anti-colonialism without a gender dimension. And I will very quickly go over these three with you. So to look at my first argument briefly, here are three examples of slogans that directly target the mythos of anti-imperialist imperialist identity of the Islamic regime. So the first one, our enemy is right here, basically very clearly targets the core of the narrative that there is an enemy in the West and basically shifts the blame back to the regime. In fact, the theme of the regime being the occupier has been very strongly present in the Women Life Freedom Uprising and its social media activities. This basically turns the anti-imperialist discourse on its head in a way that the colonizer is the Islamic regime and the colonized are the Iranian people. The second slogan, again, targets Iran's self-proclaimed position as the defender of countries that have been impacted by Western settler colonialism. Now, regardless of what Iranians think about the plight of Palestinians, this slogan shows the frustration that exists around this discourse of, Iran being the protector of the region from evil. And the last one directly addresses the hypocrisy of anti-imperialism exhibited by the regime and how the regime is not at all independent from imperial and colonial powers. While not favoring the West and not being favored by the West, it is very much in service of Russia and China's interests, as the slogan claims. A second way that the uprising opposed the anti-colonial mythos is through exposing the hypocrisy of anti-colonialism without any attention to gender equality. And this has been done specifically by using the notion of gender apartheid. Since the start of the Women Life Freedom Uprising, the term gender apartheid has become basically a recurring hashtag alongside Women Life Freedom hashtag on social media, especially on X. And the term has also been picked up and popularized by two prominent diasporic faces of the uprising, namely Masih Hadinejad and Nazanin Boniadi. And basically this perspective asks, how could a state be a transnational defender of the oppressed while oppressing half of its own population on a daily basis, based on their gender? And the advocates of employing gender apartheid in relation to the Iranian regime borrow from the legal definition of apartheid in international law, which is basically only based on racial discrimination, to argue that the Iranian state is actually a gendered apartheid state, and that gender apartheid should be recognized in international law as well. And by doing this, they both recenter gender in the legal discourse on basically identity-based systemic discrimination, and also expose the contradictions in the Iranian state's anti-imperialist discourse, arguing that not only the Iranian regime is not an anti-colonial state, but it is in fact an apartheid state. So again, turning the argument on its head. And the third argument in the paper is, unlike the other two, not about a direct epistemological shift, but instead about a pragmatic shift which undermines the regime's anti-colonial narrative by appealing to those same countries that the regime considers colonial for help. There have been calls on social media toward Western politicians and institutions, and this call has been quite diverse in its nature, so I don't want to give the impression that this is a homogeneous kind of discourse. Asking for actions from direct intervention to calls for international sanctions targeting the state and its institutions and authorities, such as, for instance, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So to kind of wrap up the whole presentation, I discussed that the Women Life Freedom Uprising highlights the exploitation of the anti-imperialist rhetoric by the Iranian regime to mask its basically internal fractions, incompetence, and authoritarianism, and that this is a critical moment and a critical juncture in understanding Iran's anti-imperialist discourse. And again, while resistance to the regime's claims of anti-imperialism have been present, the difference now is that there's not only activist or intellectual engagement with this notion, but as you saw, a street level recognition of it being a myth. And this also highlights the need for a more nuanced approach to analyzing the Iranian regime, but also other authoritarian regimes' usage of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist rhetoric, and hopefully one that recognizes the complexities and contradictions in the application or better yet, misuse or abuse of anti-colonial rhetoric. And an approach that does not fall into the trap of justifying state brutality against its citizens in the name of anti-West and anti-colonial resistance. This trap has existed, and we've seen intellectuals and scholars falling into it can immediately think of, for instance, intellectuals who sided with Assad, for instance, during the Syrian war. So this has to be the discourse that should be nuanced. And I also believe that gender analysis has been the missing puzzle piece in a lot of these misunderstandings, and a piece that finally, I hope, is falling into place thanks to the awareness raised during the Women Life Freedom Uprising and the scholarly work that comes after that. And I will stop here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rahbari. We will move immediately to our next speaker. Dr. Golkar, would you like to introduce yourself and begin your talk, and then we will have Q&A at the end of the session.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Good morning and good afternoon to Laden. Sorry, actually, I'm a little bit late. I had the difficulties to find the link, but finally I found it. So I have a PowerPoint and I'm going to share it. Hopefully it will help you to understand my thick accent. Okay. And sorry, just 1 minute. What I'm going to talk today, I will talk about women, life, freedom, or Mahsa Amini protest. And more importantly, what happened, after the protests have been brutally suppressed or put down. I will try to understand how the Islamic Republic, especially its security forces, is preparing itself for another wave of the protests, and how we can actually learn from the past, from 1979 to now, in terms of the transformation of the security forces, coercive operators, after each round of the protest or mass unrest. You know that actually the Islamic Republic came to the power in 1979, but after 1 decade, the Islamic Republic has seen a lot of wave of the protests. It started, from 1991, 1992, 3 in Mashhad, Islam Shah, Qazvin. Then you have the student protests. You have a green movement or green protest in 2009. You have 2017 18-day protest. You have 2019 Aban protest. As you can see, the phase between these protests are reducing. There are more protests, and these protests became much more radical compared to the previous round of the protest. For example, in green movement, people are asking for, where is my vote? They are asking for political freedom. They are asking for reform of the system. But in Aban 2019, this is not the case anymore. From 2019 Aban protest, the whole Islamic regime as establishment are coming to be under critics of the Iranian. And again, if you study each round of the protest and what the Islamic Republic did after that, you will realize that the most answer to each round of the protest was trying to create a new institution, coercive or security forces, or try to empower and expand the power of this institution. In 1993, for example, the Sarallah headquarters, the most important IRGC security headquarters created in Tehran in response to the Islam Shah protest, Islam Shah and Qazvin protest. In 2010, Ayatollah Khamenei approved the IRGC intelligence organization creation in response of 2009 Green Movement. So if you think about the woman life freedom that happened in 2022, 2023, my colleague talked about, how we can understand the woman life freedom. It was one of the massive mass unrest in the country, very interesting phenomenon from different point of view in terms of the people who are attending this protest, including even high schooler, the teenager girls, in terms of the message they are giving outside, their resentment or somehow enmity with even with the religion, with Islam, with burning their hijab, and targeting the whole regime. There is no difference between hardliner and quote unquote moderate anymore for these people. They believe that both of them are playing the same game. Unfortunately, the women life freedom movement have been put down brutally, like previous one. In Aban 2019, 1,500 people have been killed. In this movement, we know about 650 people have been killed, more than 1,000 people have been blind, more than 20,000 people have been put in the jail, and 10,000 people have been somehow injured in this round of the protest. So it was like previous one, the Islamic Republic used almost all of its coercive institution, including police, including Basij, including IRGC forces, even in Tehran, to put the woman life freedom down. They were very successful to do it using a very brutal approach. So the question that I have is, what happened after that? What the Islamic Republic security doctrine, institution, in terms of the institution, in terms of the tactic, how they changed in response of this protest? Why? Because without any doubt, we know that there will be another wave of the protest, and I will talk about it, why I think this is inevitable. But to understand the transformation of the Iran security forces after Mahsa Amini protests, there is a very basic chart that you can see. The supreme leader is almost controlling all aspects of the security and coercive institution. You have the IRGC. Under the IRGC or IRGC, Grand Force Operational Command, Provincial Guard, Basij region that control every city. You have the IRGC intelligence organization. In terms of the decision making, you have the Supreme National Security Council, and then you have the country security council, and you have the police. You have the MIOS, Ministry of Intelligence and Securities, and very different and sub branches of the police that I'm going to talk about it. So if you think about this chart, there are two bodies in terms of the policy making. Is a Supreme National Security Council that is working to design and and monitor implementation of the big macro security, military, and foreign policy. And you have the country security council that is mostly is under control of the Ministry of Interior, and it works in domestic politics, mostly on the security inside of the country, domestic security. Most of my talk today will focus on the police or Faraja, the transformation of this organization since 2022, and what does it mean, and to what extent they will be ready for another round of the repression. If you study the Islamic Republic after Mahsa Amini, in the middle of Mahsa Amini protests and the later, what happened, you will realize that immediately after the protests started in September 2022 and gradually spread over to all cities, about 113 cities in Iran get involved in a woman life freedom, including very conservative cities like Khomeini, the city that Ayatollah Khomeini came from. If you're familiar with that city, you know that this is a very conservative city, that even these cities have seen the protests during woman life freedom. So I try to understand the transformation of security force after Mahsa Amini protest, and I realized what the Ayatollah Khamenei did basically can be divided to three different categories. The first category is, shuffling the elite, shuffling the people who are at the head of the security forces to try to bring more loyal, more hardline people, including, for example, General Ahmadian, replacing General Shamkhani in the Supreme National Security Council, replacing the General Ahmad Radan as the head of the police. Radan was somebody who was involved in the repression of the 2009 Birin movement and have been sanctioned by the Western countries because of the brutality he implemented at that time, and even replacement of the IRGC-IO intelligence organization, replacing the General Kazemi with Hossein Taeb. There are much more going on in the middle, management rank in the security forces. But as Dr. Burjeri talked about it, there is a consolidation of hardliner everywhere. And this goes back to the Ayatollah Khamenei 2019 second step of the revolution manifestation, that it's time for us to try to, hegemonize the elite, trying to bring more loyal and more ideologic one in a state of the quote unquote pragmatist or reformist. And you can see it mostly in the security establishment after the Mahsa Amini protest started. In terms of the structural changes that if you follow this coercive institution, you can see one of the most important one was the restructuring and upgrading the Iran police forces. Najah or Niruy Intizami, or the law enforcement and law enforcement of the Islamic Republic has changed, has upgraded to the Farajar, Farmandehi Intizami. What does it mean? It means if you go back, before of the Mahsa Amini protest, police was under control of the Ministry of Interior. The head of the police always have been appointed by the supreme leader, but in terms of the logistics, in terms of the main policy, it was under control of the Ministry of Interior. After 2022 Mahsa Amini, they brought the police out of the Ministry of Interior control, and right now is under control of the Joint Staff. Equal status with the IRGC and Iranian army, trying to evaluate and upgrade the police in order to make it more coordinated with the IRGC and the Artesh, and bring it more under control of the military personnel. So you can see a part of what we can call it militarization of the police is happening here. As part of this structural change, importantly, the creation of the Police Intelligence Organization. If you remember, the MIOS, or Ministry of Intelligence and Security, established in 1983 as the most important and unique, ministry to in terms of the intelligence and security. In 2010, Ayatollah Khamenei ordered the creation of IRGC Intelligence Organization, trying to help Ministry of Intelligence and Organization and expand its responsibilities, more control over the societies. And in 2022-23, you have another new organization have been created with the same mentality and same responsibilities, gathering information online, offline, and trying to help the regime to control the societies and hopefully, maintain the political order. The Najah or the police restructuring is much more complicated. There are other elements involved, including the creation of 2 universities, like IRGC. One of the universities will focus only on training of the police officers, and another trying to bring a civilian student in a postgraduate and PhD to help the police in its mission, again, online and offline, to develop the more modern monitoring system, modern monitoring, modern repressive system. In terms of tactical and the short-term policy, what I have find is interesting. The Islamic Republic realized, right now after 4th decade of the revolution, it's lost its legitimacy completely. It's lost. Dr. Burjeri is very optimistic to think that there are 25% of the Iranian are shaping the social base based on the election. As he said, we cannot take all of this number really as approved, but they realize they have lost the legitimacy. They realize they are not able to provide social services to co-op people. So more and more they focus on modernizing, developing, and strengthening the security services. Here, there are a lot of policy have been approved, trying to, for example, to hire more than 25 1,000 new police officers in the next 5 years, trying to create 100,000 houses for the police personnel because most of them are, renting, and they are not very happy with the regime supporting them. And they intensify the ideological political training, trying to make sure they will be loyal and ideological committed to the regime, and trying to modernize the weaponry in any area that you can imagine. So all of these laws have been passed, especially in the 7 developmental plan that is going to be implemented this year for the next 5 years. The police should hire at least 25,000 more personnel, create 1,000 houses for these people, and then trying to, in other policies, the police have been asked to install more CCTV camera throughout the Iranian cities. Maybe it's interesting for you to remember that under Rouhani administration, they bought 8,000 CCTV camera from Germany, only under the Rouhani administration. And what they're asking is trying to double it in the next few years. So the police has installed the camera almost in every Iranian campus. This is we have orders from the security service to the universities that every campus, every big campus, especially in the big cities, should have the camera. They installed a lot of camera in the cemetery in Iran in order that if the families go and they start mourning and start, gathering, they have more information. Based on the information that we have, the police has the authorities to be controlled all of the municipalities, or traffic cameras throughout the country. That's a responsibility. In some cases, even the police have given the permission to have the access to the private, the security camera. The people who put the camera on their business or home trying to protect it, the police has this permission to use it. From another aspect, the security forces ask the police and ask every organization, every governmental organization to create a new law enforcement for their organization. They call it the Yegane Hefazat. And from this Yegane Hefazat originally created in 2000, but right now there is only 9 institutions in Iran, including Tehran Municipality, have this protection unit. But what the Islamic Republic asks every state bureaucracy to have their own protection unit. Why is it important? Because when the crisis starts, every law enforcement or security can go to the street. You don't need to think about protecting your organization or your building or your parameters. The last thing that I want to talk about the security forces in terms of the expansion of the collaboration with China and Russia. That's something that I really found it interesting and in very recent. Since Ahmad Radan became the head of the police, there are a lot of traveling to China, to Russia, talking with the different security forces, and we don't know the exact, moment, letters or the plan they have, but based on talking with the people who are on the ground or studying the police, and based on the secondary, information that we have, it seems that they are looking for 2 things. First, trying to use the police forces in each country in order to keep the Iranian diaspora under the control. For the first time, Women Life Freedom led to the mobilization of Iranian diaspora, very unprecedentedly everywhere in the US, in the Europe. And that's why it became a very concern for the Islamic Republic. So the new thing is every Iranian embassy should have a police attaché trying to collaborate more closely with the security services and the police in that countries. They ask for more collaboration with Interpol. It seems it's not very important thing, but if you remember that the police in Iran is not a disciplinary, is not a law enforcement organization, unlike the Western countries. In the West, this is a civilian organization under control of municipality in each city. In Iran is a national security, military, and disciplinary organization. So, to the conclusion, in the short term, what is interesting for me was, if you remember, exactly 1 year after Mahsa Amini passed away or was killed under police custody, the blue picture, another girl in Iran went to the same, fate. Armita Garanmayeh was, harassed by the morality police in Metro because she didn't have a proper hijab. We don't know exactly what happened, but she fell down, and then they took her to the hospital, and after 20 days, they announced her as a dead brain. The same story, but a very different outcome. Exactly in 1 year. Again, if you study what the security forces did after the Armita Garanmayeh dead, fall down, you will realize they tried to take control of spreading news. They put their families immediately under the surveillance, under the pressure. They stopped and they forbid any news media to write anything about this accident. They forbid the journalists to talk about this case or to investigate this case. They kept her for about 20 years. There was already, we know that she was dead in the 2 days after she fell down. But they took her in 18 days in a hospital trying to manage the atmosphere inside of the country. The last slide, and I will stop here, and I will come back to your question if you have any. What happened after Mahsa Amini? In many cases, there is nothing new. I have studied the security response to the protests in Iran, and I realize almost we are duplicating any policy. We are creating new institutions. We are empowering security forces. We are enhancing the ideological political training. The Islamic Republic has a playbook that they just repeating that and trying to create more cohesive institution. The problem is the Islamic Republic, by losing the legitimacy, and by what Ayatollah Khamenei especially did after 2009 by marginalizing pragmatic and and moderate, gradually brought a bunch of inexperienced, if I want to not put it really politically correct, full young elite, and I call it the domestication of a state. Gradually, you're replacing, for example, Jawad Zarif, that is a very experienced, foreign affairs, although from my point of view, he's not really a good guy, but still, he speaks English very well. He's very, he knows public policies. He's very good engaged in media. With somebody like Amir Abdullahian, who is not even able to speak English. So you are gradually undermining your regime. And your regime has already lost its legitimacy, religious legitimacy, because the people really are becoming more and more quote-unquote secular. And I will explain what that. And you're not legitimate even in terms of the anti-colonial perspective or religious perspective, or you're not even like China to be able to provide social services and make people happy in terms of you are losing your legitimacy, you are losing your abilities to provide this, the social service, and you are relying more and more on repression. Why? Because you know that another wave of the protest is coming. And, that's the only way is rational to think about. I'm sorry, I will stop there. Based on my studies on,
Dr. Golkar, I'm very sorry to cut you off, but I'm afraid we are very nearly out of time.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for that really interesting presentation. If we could go back away from screen sharing, there we are. Okay, all three of our speakers have offered quite a lot to talk about here, and I'd like to invite anyone who's participating online, if you want to pop a question into the chat or to the Q&A, you'll see the button at the bottom of your screen. Okay, and while we're waiting maybe for people to type in their questions, as the three of you were talking, the first two presentations, I was thinking, you know, this is really a good case for the current approach of the regime being unsustainable, despite election engineering, but based on the kind of protests and pushback they're getting and the effect that seems to be having. But then listening to Dr. Golkar, I wondered if perhaps the state is not perceiving that the same way and is in fact just doubling down on these, what Dr. Ben Meir called this morning, you know, rule by the sword. So do you think that this is sustainable? Or do you think that the regime is perceiving an unsustainability of their current practices? Or should we expect to see a shift in the next few years? This is for all of you.
Dr. Burjardi, you are the
Sure, I will go first. Look, you know, I think all of us are indicating the following dynamics in the Islamic Republic, right? That there is truly a strong sense of frustration, resentment, alienation of the public that certainly will guarantee that we will have other uprisings, movements in the coming years. This divorce between the citizenry and the state is a fact of life in Iran, right? But as I tried to explain in my presentation, I think the state has recognized that, and Dr. Golkar's presentation only lends credence to this argument that therefore they have decided that the best way to handle any upcoming wave of protests is again to resort to repression, right? So if you look at it from a logical perspective, one would have to ask themselves the question of, you know, the opportunity cost for the state. My conclusion is that they have come to the recognition that the level of internal dissent and the level of, you know, their national interest as they are articulating it in terms of regional activities is such that it is better to lose popular legitimacy for the sake of a state consolidation, especially as this, you know, transition to a next supreme leader might be upon us, you know, sooner rather than later, right? I call it as a Faustian bargain. The state has engaged in a Faustian bargain with its eyes quite open in terms of what it is getting into.
Yes, and if I may, I just quickly want to second that exactly. And as we heard in the first presentation by Merzad, the way that there is a consolidation of the kind of conservative front happening, and then Said was talking about how there is this again enforcement and securitization happening. On the other hand, if we go back to my presentation, how we have the crumbling of certain, you know, facades happening, and we have more radical uprisings, we have more radical younger generations. I do believe that, first of all, there is recognition. There is a very, very well realization that the system is only basically maintainable through pure force. And at the same time, my fear is that this will also, well, there is fear and hope. I guess they're two sides of the same coin. There will be more tension, and this only leads to, yeah, basically more clashes between different forces. And I think in this way, the three presentations, rather accidentally, because I didn't know what you were going to talk about, very clearly spoke to each other.
I completely agree. You know, this survivability is not sustainability. You know, the regime is not sustainable, it's just surviving. There are a mass frustration, resentment, disappointment among of the Iranian. And the Islamic Republic realized that, you know, they have lost Iranian middle class, they have lost Iranian poor, and they just want to stay in the power, rule by the sword, as another colleague said, rely on the small social basis. And that's why, you know, they invested massively on the security forces, because they know that the main important enemy of the Islamic Republic is not outside of the Iran, is the Iranian people. But they believe, and I hope they are wrong, but they still believe that they have the upper hand. They are able to justify any level of brutalities using the religion, and they believe that if they can just make this 10, 15, 20, in my opinion, 10% of the people happy, they are able to rule no matter if 90% are, resenting the regime. This calculation can, change, or it can actually, hopefully, it will change. Specifically, Dr. Bourjiri, in the times of the succession. In the times of the succession, in a few days or a very short moment of the time that the leader has gone, if the leader passed away without appointing anybody, and the assembly experts coming to pick somebody, this short amount of the time, if the people are on the street protesting, if there are international crises, can change rapidly to the very big crisis for the Islamic Republic. Because the new leader still is not in the power. Those security forces don't know to what extent the new leader will support them, no matter what. They know Ayatollah Khamenei will support them no matter what. They know that even if they kill 1,500 people, there is not going to happen to them. But they are not sure about the next supreme leader. So there is a very short moment. I'm optimistic about that this happened, but it needs mass mobilization from societies, pressure from the international communities. Then maybe we have opportunities for opening up. Other than that, I'm very pessimist about the future.
Thank you. We have one question from the audience. Insight around what are the alternative systems for this regime? And Dr. Bourjiri, I wonder if you could maybe address that. Are there alternatives?
Yeah. Well, you see, the argument that social scientists have put forward is that when you close the doorways to reform, you make revolutions inevitable. And I think that's really the long-term question confronting the current regime in Iran, right? Will they come to their senses? Is there still a possibility for rapprochement with the citizenry through some serious, not cosmetic changes happening, to make a revolution sort of inevitable? Frankly, I think the balance of forces in Iran at the current moment are such that I really do not see the possibility of a revolution. I don't see that happening. I see frequent uprisings, as we have seen in the past, right? But unfortunately, we are dealing with a regime, armed to the teeth, that still has the balance of forces in its power in suppressing the opposition. So the question really is the following. If a transition happens in terms of the supreme leader, there is a new guy in charge, right? And, he takes a look at the opportunity cost at the level of alienation, at the, international isolation of the regime, etc., and whether they decide that pursuing a more reformist path of action is possible. If not, then I think we need to embrace ourselves for the fact that the frequency and the severity of this opposition movement is only going to pick up momentum because, frankly, the economy also happens to be the Achilles heel of this state, right? They have no way possible to address their financial economic problems, as we see with the runaway inflation and the like. So it's a safe bet to think that we will, have further uprisings, and they can happen at any moment for any cause, right? It just takes a spark for us to see yet again millions of people coming out to the street. But whether that's going to be decisive or not, I think the jury is still out on that question.
Thank you so much for that. And thank all of our presenters. I'm afraid we're out of time. I see one more question from the audience, but I can forward that to our panelists later, as we are going to have to end this session now. Thank you all so much for joining us, and especially to our speakers for these wonderful talks. We're going to end the session now.